The air in Chamber 7 of the Trinebula station hummed with the low thrum of environmental controls and the even lower thrum of unspoken tension. High Archivist K-Leave of the Loraxian Confederacy adjusted the silver circlet that pressed against their smooth, elongated cranium. Optical filaments, finer than spun glass, pulsed with a soft blue light as they interfaced with K-Leave's neural pathways, granting instant access to the vast, meticulously ordered Loraxian Central Archives, a repository of galactic history so complete, so perfectly cross-referenced, that the Loraxians considered themselves not merely historians, but the very custodians of universal truth. Halev's multiple, slender limbs shifted beneath their flowing data-weave robes. They regarded the human delegation across the polished Neilwood table with an expression that mingled academic curiosity with a faint, almost imperceptible disdain. Humans, a species of such bewildering contradictions, capable of surprising bursts of innovation, yet their historical records, from what the Loraxians had bothered to sample, were a chaotic jumble of myth, emotion, and poorly substantiated claims. They were, in K-Leave's assessment, a species driven by the ephemeral whims of feeling rather than the enduring clarity of logic. Their memories were short, their grudges, while occasionally fiery, ultimately forgetful. Today's agenda concerned the allocation of resource rights in the newly charted Xylo sector, a region shimmering with potential rare minerals, harvestable exotic gases, and strategically valuable null-gravity pockets. The Loraxian claim was, as always, impeccably documented, based on predictive stellar cartography and resource modeling that had flagged Xylos as a region of interest decades before its official discovery. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Evian Vale, a woman whose face bore the lines of pragmatic negotiation. Beside her sat Dr. Eris Thorne, a figure K-Leave had barely registered. Thorne was of average height, with hair the color of dark earth and eyes that seemed to absorb the room's light without reflecting much back. He had remained silent throughout the initial pleasantries, a quiet observer. K-Leave categorized him as a minor attaché, likely present for internal human record-keeping, a task the Loraxians imagined humans performed with their characteristic inefficiency. The immediate point of contention crystallized around a cluster of 12 planetoids, rich in the hyperdense mineral Rylium-7. Ambassador Vale, her voice calm but firm, outlined the human claim. The Xylo C7 planetoid cluster falls within the primary exploration sphere of the human colony on Cygnus Prime. Furthermore, initial survey rights were established by the Earth vessel Pathfinder nearly 2 standard centuries ago, during its charting mission of the then-unnamed Xylos Void. The Pathfinder established a temporary research outpost on Xylos C7 Alpha, which, regrettably, was lost during the Arcturus incursion. High Archivist K-Leave allowed a delicate, three-fingered hand to hover over their temple circlet. Data streamed into their consciousness. "Ah, yes," K-Leave intoned, their voice a silken glissando that barely concealed their condescension. "The Arcturus incident, as your records quaintly label it." A faint, shimmering data slate materialized above K-Leave's wrist, displaying archaic script and faded imagery for the Loraxian delegation to see. A minor border skirmish involving a short-lived, now extinct marauder species. Our archives confirm the loss of a temporary, unshielded human research station. Casualties. Minimal, under 2 dozen by your count. Duration of conflict. Less than one of your solar days. This event occurred, as you noted, approximately 200 of your Earth years in the past. K-Leave made a dismissive gesture, as if brushing away a speck of dust. Surely, Ambassador, such ancient history, such a trivial footnote in the grand tapestry of galactic events, holds no logical bearing on current resource allocation in a sector of this magnitude. Human sentimentality regarding past losses is noted, but it can hardly serve as a valid foundation for interstellar legal claims. The implied message was clear. Your emotional attachment to your species' minor tragedies is irrelevant. Ambassador Vale's lips thinned, a clear sign of her displeasure. She opened her mouth to retort, but a quiet voice interjected. High Archivist K-Leave, Ambassador Vale, if I may. All eyes turned to Dr. Eris Thorne. He sat with his hands resting calmly on the table, his demeanor unassuming. Kaylee felt a flicker of surprise, then mild annoyance. This minor academic functionary wished to speak. "You may," Kaylee allowed, the tone suggesting they were humoring a child. "Thank you," Thorne said, his voice even. The Arcturus incident, while perhaps appearing as a footnote, when viewed through the vast lens of the Loraxian archives, has dimensions that may not be immediately apparent. With your permission, I would like to present supplementary data from Earth's historical archives. Kayleave exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance with their chief aide, Archivist Naaman. The aide's subtle outwitch conveyed shared amusement. A human data presentation. This should be illustrative of their methods. "Permission granted, Dr. Thorne," Kayleave said, a hint of patronizing curiosity in their voice. "We are always interested in observing the archival practices of other species." They leaned back, prepared for a disorganized dump of poorly correlated files, perhaps a few emotionally charged personal logs. Thorne nodded. He produced a small, sleek interface device, no larger than his palm, and connected it to the main holographic display unit at the center of the table. The vast screen, previously showing Loraxian star charts, flickered and then resolved into a surprisingly clean, minimalist interface. The Loraxians watched, a collective eyebrow metaphorically raised. "I will begin with the commonly accepted records of the Arcturus incident," Thorne stated. The display shifted, showing crisp, digitized versions of the Pathfinder's final log entries, official casualty lists from the period, and after-action reports filed by the Colonial Relief Squadron that arrived too late. The data was presented clearly, efficiently. It was unexpectedly organized. Kaylee felt a moment's recalibration. Perhaps this Thorne was more competent than his unassuming appearance suggested. Still, the content was as expected. "As your own records confirm, High Archivist," Thorne continued, "a small outpost, a brief engagement, limited direct losses." Kayleave gave a slight nod. "Indeed, a historical footnote, as I stated, tragic for those involved, undoubtedly, but strategically insignificant in the long passage of time." "Perhaps," Thorne said, "but let us examine the ripples from that footnote." The display changed. Intricate charts began to flow across the screen, lines of light connecting data points across decades. "This is an economic impact analysis of the Arcturus incident on the then-nascent human colonies in the Epsilon Eridani sector, the closest developed region to Xylos at the time." The charts depicted a sharp decline in intercolony trade along routes perceived to be vulnerable after the raid. Insurance premiums for merchant vessels traversing the Arcturus drift skyrocketed and remained inflated for nearly 50 standard years. Resources that had been earmarked for colonial expansion and scientific research were diverted to bolster defensive capabilities across the entire sector. "This diversion," Thorne explained, his voice a calm counterpoint to the complex data flowing on the screen, "is estimated to have retarded economic growth in the Epsilon Eridani sector by approximately 7.4% over a 30-year period. The direct cost of the lost outpost was minimal. The indirect economic consequences, however, were substantial and generational." Loraxian archivists on Kayleave's side of the table began to murmur amongst themselves, their optical implants pulsing faster. Their archival methodology prized direct, linear causality. This human approach of tracing such broad, multi-generational socioeconomic impacts from what they considered a minor military event was unusual, disconcertingly thorough. The display shifted again. Haunting melodies began to play softly, accompanied by images of rough-hewn sculptures and faded, handwritten texts. "These are examples of cultural artifacts from the Epsilon Eridani colonies," Thorne said. "Ballads composed about the lost crew of Arcturus, epic poems detailing the marauder's curse. Children's stories, even now, sometimes feature shadowy villains from the dark stars beyond Arcturus." He highlighted specific phrases, linguistic markers that had entered the local dialects, all referencing the loss and the perceived threat. The incident became a cultural touchstone, a cautionary tale woven into the fabric of these colonies, shaping their worldview, their art, their folklore, even their anxieties for generations. Kaleev's smooth brow furrowed. This was not data in the Loraxian sense. This was emotional detritus, codified and preserved. The idea that a species would allow such a minor historical event to contaminate its culture so deeply was profoundly illogical to them, inefficient. Then the star charts returned, but overlaid with shifting vectors and highlighted regions. Following the Arcturus incident, Thorne continued, his tone unwavering. Human strategic planning for colonial defense in what was then designated the Delta Quadrant underwent significant revision. This led directly to the formulation and adoption of the Watchful Links Doctrine. The display showed schematics of dispersed sensor networks, blueprints for new classes of rapid response corvettes, and operational paradigms emphasizing proactive patrols in outer rim territories. This doctrine, refined and updated continuously over the subsequent 2 centuries, remains a core component of Human Systems Alliance defensive posture in this region of space. Current patrol routes of Alliance vessels were illuminated, their paths subtly influenced by the need to cover vulnerabilities first identified because of that long-ago skirmish. The murmuring among the Loraxian specialists ceased. They stared at the display, their earlier amusement entirely gone, replaced by a focused, uneasy attention. High Archivist Kaleev's serene composure was beginning to show faint cracks, a certain rigidity in their posture. The human wasn't just presenting history. He was presenting a lineage of consequence that was uncomfortably active. The Arcturus incident, High Archivist, Dr. Thorne stated, his quiet voice now holding an undeniable weight in the suddenly still chamber, is not merely a memory recorded in our databases. It is an ongoing lesson, one that has been integrated into the very fabric of our presence in this galactic arm. The holographic display, under Thorne's calm direction, shifted once more. It now focused on the official insignia of a specific Human Systems Alliance naval squadron, the 77th Frontier Defense Wing. Prominently displayed beneath the stylized human eagle was their primary battle honor, rendered in stark block lettering. Relief of the Arcturus perimeter, 2247 SE. Standard error. Beside it, the squadron motto, which Thorne's interface translated simultaneously into Loraxian standard script. We do not forget. Kaleev's slender body gave an involuntary twitch, a minute contraction that would have been missed by anyone not as acutely observant as a trained Loraxian archivist. But Thorne saw it. He knew the Loraxians, for all their intellectual prowess, struggled with the concept of emotion as a motivator for sustained, generation-spanning policy. Furthermore, Thorne continued, his voice cool and precise, the Watchful Links Doctrine isn't just a theoretical framework. This is a declassified segment from the current basic training curriculum for all Alliance recruits assigned to the Fifth Fleet, which operates in the territories bordering the Xylos sector. The display filled with tactical diagrams, simulated battlefield scenarios. One specific simulation, designated Exercise Silent Sentinel, depicted a surprise attack on an isolated resource outpost by an unknown aggressor. The attack vectors, the enemy tactics, the very nature of the simulated engagement. It was an almost perfect mirror of the historical accounts of the Arcturus incident. We train our personnel for what has been, Thorne explained, to ensure they are prepared for what could be again. Every cadet in that fleet knows the story of Arcturus. Not as ancient history, but as a standing operational example. The color had drained slightly from Kaleev's normally pale gray features. The optical filaments around their circlet pulsed erratically for a moment before steadying. The other Loraxians were utterly still, their gazes fixed on the human historian, then at their own high archivist, as if seeking guidance for how to process this anomaly. Thorne then linked it all to the present dispute. Our claim to the Xylos see 7 planetoids, High Archivist, he said, his eyes meeting Kaleev's directly. is not rooted in misplaced sentimentality for a lost outpost from 2 centuries past. It is rooted in the strategic imperative, an imperative learned and reinforced through meticulous, continuous analysis of that minor skirmish and its consequences. An imperative that dictates that such a vital resource nexus, situated at a key strategic corridor, must not fall into potentially unstable hands, or worse, become an unmonitored staging ground for threats against our established territories and trade routes. The loss at Arcturus, insignificant as it may seem to you, directly and profoundly informed the value we place on securing systems like Xylos and the vigilance with which we approach them. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the soft hum of the station's life support. Kayleigh finally spoke, their voice strained, losing its usual smooth cadence. But this is an obsession. To allow such a distant, minor historical footnote to dictate grand strategy, to shape military doctrine and resource claims 2 full centuries later. It is, it is profoundly inefficient. It is a flaw in your species' cultural data processing. Such an attachment to ancient grievance is illogical. Dr. Aris Thorne offered a small, almost sad smile. High Archivist Kayleigh, he replied, his voice carrying no triumph, only a statement of fact. You perceive our history as a collection of dusty, disconnected records in a vault. For humanity, it is a living testament, a continuous narrative. Every achievement, every failure, every sacrifice, every loss, no matter how small, is recorded, cross-referenced, analyzed, and integrated. Our archives are not mausoleums for bygone eras. They are active, dynamic components of our present, constantly shaping our assessment of the future. They represent the collective, evolving memory of a species that learns, that adapts, and that remembers its debts, those it owes, and those inflicted upon it. What you dismiss as a flaw, an illogical obsession with ancient history, we consider resilience. What you label a footnote, we call an open lesson, perpetually studied. Our history does not simply inform us, it drives us. Lorexian delegation was utterly silent. The full, terrifying implication of humanity's approach to its own past began to dawn on them. They were not negotiating with a forgetful, emotionally volatile species. They were facing a civilization that meticulously documented every perceived slight, every loss, every injustice, and then built its future strategies, its military doctrines, its very cultural identity upon those foundations of carefully catalogued fury and unwavering remembrance. Every interaction with humanity, they were suddenly, chillingly aware, could have repercussions that echoed not for years or decades, but for centuries, meticulously noted and potentially, one day, acted upon. The human archive was not a tomb of forgotten facts. It was an armory of patient grudges. High Archivist Kayleigh stared at Thorne, their multifaceted eyes, usually darting with quick calculations, now fixed and wide. The serene confidence that had defined their bearing was gone, replaced by a profound, visible unease. The shimmering data slate at their wrist had gone dark. For a long moment, the only sound was the almost inaudible whir of the station's air recyclers. Kayleigh's slender fingers twitched, a sign of deep agitation in their species. Finally, with a slight tremor in their voice that was utterly alien to their usual composed pronouncements, Kayleigh uttered a single word in Lorexian, a word that needed no translation given their expression. Recess. Without waiting for formal acknowledgement, the High Archivist rose, their movements stiff, and swept from the chamber. The rest of the Lorexian delegation followed hastily, their usual precise formations abandoned in their haste, a distinct air of consternation hanging about them like a shroud. Ambassador Vale looked at Dr. Thorne, a flicker of stunned admiration in her eyes. Thorne merely gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his expression neutral as he began to calmly disconnect his interface. Behind the closed doors of the Lorexian legation, the atmosphere was one of controlled panic. Encrypted, tight beam communications blazed a trail across subspace to the Lorexian homeworld, to the Grand Archive itself. Thorne's presentation, every chart, every cultural reference, every strategic doctrine linked back to the Arcturus incident, was being dissected, analyzed, and reanalyzed with frantic urgency. The initial Lorexian assessment of human historical memory as short and emotionally driven was being catastrophically revised. What they had perceived as chaos was, in fact, a different, terrifying kind of order, an order built on the relentless accumulation and application of grievances. Negotiations resumed the following station cycle. The change in the Loraxian demeanor was palpable. The air of intellectual superiority had vanished, replaced by a cautious, almost deferential respect. High Archivist K-Leave, their composure outwardly restored, but their eyes still holding a shadow of the previous day's shock, addressed Ambassador Vale directly, their tone modulated to one of careful diplomacy. Dr. Aris Thorne, they noted, was now regarded by the Loraxians with a new, wary deference, as if he were the custodian of some unpredictable, ancient power. The dispute over the Xylo C7 planetoids was resolved with surprising alacrity. The Loraxian Confederacy, after offering only token counterarguments, conceded the primary human claims. They even offered additional concessions on adjacent, less critical resource zones, citing a desire for fostering long-term amicable relations based on mutual understanding of historical perspectives. The coded message was clear. We understand now. We will tread carefully. News of the Xylo's revelation, as it quickly became known in the discreet channels of galactic diplomacy and intelligence, spread like a whispered contagion. The image of the Loraxian Confederacy, the galaxy's undisputed masters of historical record, being so thoroughly schooled by a human historian using their own primitive archives, was a potent one. It forced a wholesale re-evaluation of humanity across many civilizations. A new understanding of Homo sapiens began to solidify. They were not merely the chaotic, emotionally volatile, and forgetful species many had assumed. Instead, they possessed a cultural memory of terrifying length and precision, an ability to nurse grievances not for years, but for centuries, meticulously documenting every slight, every loss, and allowing those embers of the past to actively forge the steel of their future actions. The phrase, first uttered by a Zalosian trade delegate observing the aftermath, began to circulate. To offend a human is to etch your transgression into a library that never forgets, and whose librarians always, eventually, collect their dues. Dr. Aris Thorne, and by extension human historians and archivists in general, gained a new, somewhat intimidating reputation on the galactic stage. They were no longer seen as dusty academics tending to forgotten lore. They were the keepers of the grudge, the archivists of fury, the silent, watchful guardians of humanity's long, unforgiving, and meticulously weaponized memory. From that day forward, any species entering negotiations with humans or contemplating any action that might impact human interests learned to do so with a newfound respect for the deep, cold currents of history that ran beneath the surface of human affairs. They learned to check humanity's historical records very, very carefully.